Well, we're going to turn this evening to these verses that we read together in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 23 and 24 really encapsulate the thrust of the apostles' teaching in these verses. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And our subject this evening is the heart of gospel preaching. And of course, it is the cross of Christ, Christ crucified, that is at the heart of gospel preaching. And this passage is all about confidence in the preaching of the cross. And it's vital that we have that confidence. We live in a day when many in the church overlook the centrality of preaching. We hear reports sometimes of churches where there's half an hour, 3/4 of an hour of some kind of musical entertainment, and then there's a 10 or 15-minute homily or message. The cross and the preaching of the cross has lost its centrality. And there are others in the church that retain their confidence in preaching, but they do not recognize that the hub, the heart, the focus of the preaching in the church is the cross of Christ. And so let me ask that question this evening. This is really where I'm coming from. Do we have confidence in the preaching of the cross of Christ? Now, in Paul's day, there were many that heard his preaching and they rejected it. And he refers here to the Jews, and they rejected it because they were anticipating an earthly and national renaissance. They wanted to see a Messiah who would bring back the heyday of Israelite prosperity as a nation, emancipation from the Roman overlords, and the idea that their Messiah had been crucified seemed to them a great stumbling block. And then Paul speaks of the Greek world or culture, which wanted a rational and philosophical explanation for life. And the idea that the focal point and the focus for the true wisdom, the true understanding of life, putting everything into perspective, was a crucified person, to them was foolishness, and nothing has changed today. Many people reject the preaching of the cross. Verse 22 speaks of those that ask or require a sign, and those that seek after wisdom. And it's been pointed out that this verse encapsulates so many that reject or regard preaching or the preaching of the cross as foolishness. They are those that ask, they require, they demand signs and wonders. Well, where's the proof? Where are the evidences, the tangible evidences in life of your supernatural God? And then there are others that require or seek after human wisdom. Everything has got to be explained rationally. They want a philosophy that fits in with human psyche and human thinking, and they are not prepared to think outside that box. And when that happens, there is, of course, a temptation for the church to change the message, or if not the message, to change the means to accommodate the lost around us. People are not listening. They're not responding to the gospel. We preach, but no one wants to hear preaching. We need to adapt ourselves to a different culture. If it means using drama or film or some other medium, we will follow it. But the Apostle Paul makes very clear here that he understood that the church's commission, and we must make no misunderstanding here, Paul speaks as a representative of the church. He is the founding father of so many of those early churches. And when Paul speaks of himself in verse 17 as being sent to preach the gospel, he's saying, I am the prototype for all preachers that would follow me, for the church of Jesus Christ that is being established in AD 60, but must also be furthered down the centuries of time. So if we are going to be faithful to the calling of God as a church, as it is encapsulated here, we must be the example of Paul the Apostle. And there are three questions I want to answer this evening. The first is this: what is the preaching of the cross? The second, why does it get rejected by many? I've sort of answered that, but we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. And thirdly, why must we continue to preach Christ crucified? So what is meant here by, in verse 18, the preaching of the cross, which to the world around in Paul's day and ours is foolishness? Well, the cross is synonymous with the whole scheme of God's plan of salvation. It's the very focal point, the very accomplishment. If you take the cross out of preaching, you rip the heart out of the gospel message. You do not really have a Christianity left. We could answer this question, what is the preaching of the cross, with three further questions. Who is it about? What did they do? And why did they do it? Well, of course, it's about the Son of God. The Son of God himself. That's focal. That's vital. Those that question the deity of Christ, they begin to undermine the very cross that we preach, because it is the cross upon which the Son of God, in all his perfections, in all his sinlessness, in all his acceptability to his Father in heaven, died. But let's answer the second question. What did he do? Well, he died. He suffered and died upon a cross. And firstly, we have to say he died vicariously. You know what that word vicar means? Perhaps some of us, well, we know what a vicar is, but do we know why he's called a vicar? And why I'm not a vicar? The word vicar means one who stands in the place or as a representative of others. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church says the Pope is the vicar of Christ. He stands in the place of Christ. He has Christ's authority on earth. And when he makes rules and decrees and so on, you follow him as if he was Christ. But preachers have never made that claim. We are the ambassadors of Christ, but we are not Christ. And we are not the vicars of Christ. But Christ died vicariously as the representative and in the place of all his people. It was a vicarious death, and that is preached when the cross is faithfully preached. It was a sacrificial death. In other words, it was necessary because it was for sin and for sinners. And this is the most offensive part of the preaching of the cross. This is why the Jews were stumbled by the preaching, because the implication was to the Jews, you're not good enough for God. There was no other good enough to pay the price of sin. And the Jews thought that because they were God's people and they had God's law and they kept it in that outward form and way, that they were acceptable to God. Many people think the same today. And to them, the preaching of the cross is a stumbling block, because it says to that person, you're not good enough for God. You're not good enough to get to heaven. In fact, whatever you do, it won't be good enough in order to satisfy the demands of a perfect divine law. The cross is most necessary because Christ would suffer there the punishment for the sins of every single person who enters the gate of heaven. There's no other way in. The preaching of the cross makes that clear. Christ's work was an atoning work. It settled the debt. It paid the penalty. And unless the cross is preached in that sense, the gospel has not been preached. The church has failed in its function. And if anyone is in a church that does not preach the cross, they should get out of that church. Now, we don't encourage divisions and schisms and church hopping, but there must be the preaching of the cross. It's the primary duty of the people of God and the church of God. And why? This is the third thing. Why must we preach the cross? What was it about? Well, it's because it is the only way. It is by the cross of Christ and all that was accomplished there that the sinner can be at peace with God, can be reconciled with heaven, can find the gate to heaven opened. How much does the cross mean to you and I this evening? Now, many of us are Christians, but some of us here, we've not professed our faith. What does the cross mean to us? Do you look at that cross and say, I understand that it is wholly necessary, and my soul depends upon Christ's work at Calvary? The cross explains the human condition. And this is why, in some ways, it's foolishness to the Greek culture, Western culture as well, if you like, because it explains the problem of evil. When the cross is preached, said Augustine, we see there a pulpit from which is declared the holiness of God, or the justice of God, and the love of God. They're both declared, proclaimed in the cross. It's like a pulpit that declares those things. But it says to this world and to our Western world, the deep-seated problem in your society is evil. It is man's rebellion. It is man's sin. It is the fall. The world is in chaos today. Nation is at war with nation. Society has within it factions that are squabbling. There is decline. There is so much misery. But what's behind it all? The cross is the explanation. Sin and the exceeding sinfulness of sin is declared at Calvary. So there's the first question. What is the preaching of the cross? It's that Christ died and what he accomplished there and why it was necessary. Secondly, why does the preaching of the cross get rejected by many? Now, Paul, in one sense, divides those that reject the gospel, firstly into two groups, but then he brings them back together again. We've already looked at the fact that the Jews and those of a Jewish mindset, religious people who think that they're good enough for God, they're offended. They've got their revelation of God. They've got their religion. The idea that a Saviour, indeed the Son of God himself, must die, it's a great stumbling block. It's an offence to them. You're telling me that I'm such a bad person that it would take the Son of God himself to step into my shoes, as it were, and to endure what I should deserve, which is an awful death, the punishment of a holy God poured out eternally upon my soul. I cannot accept that. And then there are others who regard it as foolishness. This word foolishness, it's the word from which we get moron. And without meaning to be crass, there is a sense in which Paul is saying here, the Greeks listen to my preaching and they think I'm a moron. That's literally what's behind this word foolishness. These morons who go around declaring that a common criminal murdered by the Romans or executed by the Romans as a troublemaker, you're telling me that this man was the Son of God that he has power to judge me, that he has power to save me. This is foolishness. I cannot accept it. But then Paul brings those two groups back together and says, actually, there's only one group. He describes them here. Verse 18, them that perish. Them that perish. And in one sense, it includes everyone outside of Christ. But it's interesting because this word perish, it's actually what we call a participle. Them that are perishing, those who are on the way to being lost. And the apostle is saying, they are the ones who reject my preaching. And they are the reason they reject my preaching is because they are perishing ones. We mustn't lose sight of that, because this is often the first point at which people turn away from the confidence they ought to have in not only the message of the cross, but the preaching of that message as being central. If we remember that all that reject it and find it to be stupidity or an offense, it is because they are on the way to being lost. They are perishing souls. And if any of us here this evening, in our hearts, we think that the message of Christ and Christ crucified is really just a stupidity, is foolishness, then I can tell you the reason you think that. If you're online and you're thinking like that, it's because you have a soul that is perishing, on the way to being lost. And until that state of your heart changes, you won't find the preaching of the cross to be anything other than foolishness. So thirdly, why must we continue as churches to preach the cross of Christ? And the answer given here really, if we unfold these verses, is because it is the only way, the only means of being saved. So let's go back to verse 18, first of all. The preaching of the cross is to them that are perishing foolishness, but unto us which are saved. It's interesting, this word saved is also a participle. Them who are being saved. If you're a Christian here this evening, then Paul describes you as a person who is being saved. It's not a perfect tense, something that's finished and done with. It's something that has a past, a present, and a future aspect. Our being saved began before today, didn't it? In fact, it began before we were born. It began when God the Father and God the Son purposed to save us. It was happening when Christ himself was crucified. His people were being saved. But subjectively, when we think of ourselves, it began when God first called us through his word by his Spirit. Verse 24 says, them which are called, those whom God has so spoken to that they hear his voice, awakening them, convicting them. Salvation has a past, it has a present. If you are a Christian, if I am a Christian this evening, we are being saved. That work is going on. Increasingly, the power and the influence of sin in our life is being weakened. And the influence and the authority of Christ and his law and his word is being strengthened. That's part of being saved. And salvation will not be complete until Christ returns and we are received unto himself and given those resurrection bodies. It's a process. But the reason people receive the preaching of the cross is because they are being saved. And part of being saved is calling us to Christ, moving us to believe what is proclaimed concerning Christ. And the apostle tells us here in verse 18, but unto us which are being saved, it is the power of God. In other words, the very opposite of the foolishness that this world perceives. The world of unbelievers, the perishing world, it looks at as sinners. It looks at Christ and it hears the message and says, this is just nonsense. But when the Lord speaks its truths into our heart, it has the power to transform. It has the power to speak peace to troubled consciences. It has the power to grant joy on a deathbed. It has the power to break the snare of sin and a love of the world. You think of men like John Newton in the depths of sin, depraved lifestyle. And yet, when the Lord spoke to his soul and he understood the power of Christ crucified, his whole life was changed. One who had lived as an enemy of God became a servant of Christ. One who had no peace within suddenly knew that peace of reconciliation with an offended God. It has the power to change the direction. It has the power to lift out of the swamp of sin. And Paul refers to that here. Therefore, he says, we must preach these things because there is such a power to the preaching of Christ crucified. In other words, Paul is saying here, the problem isn't the message or the preaching of that message or indeed the messenger. The problem lies with the hearer. It's foolishness to us until the Lord begins to save us. Remember the context here is division in the church at Corinth. Oh, well, we want to follow Apollos. No, I'm going to follow Paul. No, I'm going to follow Peter. The apostle is telling us here, what matters is not the messenger, it's the message. It doesn't matter whether it's Paul or Apollos or Cephas or some other man. Is the message of the cross what we have embraced, and is it what we preach? In verse 19, Paul quotes from Isaiah chapter 29. It is written, he says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. That was a verse in Isaiah chapter 29, verse 14. And the context there is that Isaiah had been rejected by the leaders and the counselors of Jerusalem. They were in trouble and under threat from Sennacherib and Rabshakeh, the Assyrian forces that laid siege to Jerusalem. And Isaiah said, you turn to the Lord. And they said, these counselors, no, we turn to Egypt. We'll seek help from Egypt and its mercenaries. And in the midst of that controversy, the Lord foretells God's way is to destroy the wisdom and the prudence and the pragmatism, if you like, of this world. Well, we resort to human means. And you can bring that right forward. And this is what Paul is encouraging us to do here. There are many people today, and they'll say, well, the world is in crisis, or my life is in crisis. How am I going to solve my problems? Well, I'll resort to all sorts of human ingenuity and human ideas and inventions. But the one thing people won't do is turn to the cross of Christ. If you go up to someone in the street, and I'm making a generalization here, but for the most part, if you say to someone on the street who's in trouble or who looks at our society and says it's in a mess, and you say to them, you know, what you need is Christ. What you need is the crucified one. It doesn't cut much ice with the average man in the street. To him, he'll say, are you a fool? Are these things, are you still in your right mind? But this is exactly what Paul is saying. The world regard these things as foolishness until the Lord deals with them. And yet, the cross is the very means, the very plan of God for the salvation of souls. So just stop here a minute and think. if we follow the temptation to say, well, if we simply proclaim what the Bible teaches about salvation, about Christ and the cross, and how it declares our sinfulness and our ruin, then we're not getting very far. We need to adapt to a modern era. We need to accommodate ourselves to our society. Now, of course, we present the message in a relevant way, in a way that will engage with the lost, but we cannot change the message. That's what Paul's telling us here, because it's this message that the world need to hear. If they won't hear it because they are perishing, that's not our business. We leave that with a sovereign God. And if he begins to call and save souls out of this world, they will hear the cross. It will be more than music to their ears. They will come to recognize its wisdom and its power. And so we come down to verse 23. We preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, unto the Greeks foolishness, but unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the wisdom of God, or the power of God, and the wisdom of God. We must place our confidence in this message and in this means. Bring those two things together. We preach the cross, but also we preach the cross. We don't act it out. We don't present it through cartoon characters. We proclaim it with soberness, with seriousness, with a sense of the gravitas of which it speaks and conveys. We proclaim these things because we believe that they are the only means for the salvation of the soul. Once we are being saved, when the Lord calls the sinner and awakens him, then these things will be seen so differently. You remember, there's a hymn, it's not in our book, written by Robert Murray McCheyne. He says, there was a time when Jehovah Sidkinu meant nothing to me. But when the Lord dealt with him as an older teenager, and he saw the vanity of this world and the futility and the wickedness of his life, then God meant everything to him. Christ meant everything to him. And so it will be. And so, verse 24 tells us, unto them which are called, Christ, the power of God. The power that we experience within to speak peace to our souls, to move us to a hatred of sin and a love of holiness, to stir us to service. We eye Christ at Calvary, dying in the place of our souls, and we say, if he did that for me, then I must do all I can for him. It's the power that motivated Paul to endure stonings and buffetings and shipwrecks and cold and destitution and hunger. He lists them all. What was the power behind that servant of Christ? It was the cross. He said, we thus judge that if one died for all, then were all dead, and that they which live should henceforth live not unto themselves, but unto him who died for them. It's the power of the cross. It was that same power that convinced Judson and McCheyne and Spurgeon and William Carey and many others to labour for the Lord, willing to lose their lives for the one who had laid down his life for them. The wisdom of God. It makes no sense to the world. Verse 21 says that in the wisdom of God, in the plan of God, it was his purpose that the world, by its own wisdom, would not find God. The world says, we'll find out the truth. We'll find out the origins of our existence and so on. It's all part and parcel of the same thing, really. But the world, by its own wisdom, it couldn't find God. But, says the apostle, it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching. Foolishness in the eyes of the world, that is, not in the eyes of the church or in the eyes of God, but what the unbeliever thinks is foolishness. The message and the method God ordains to be the very means whereby souls will be saved. The wisdom of God. We see the genius of that plan of salvation because it accomplished for me what I cannot accomplish for myself. We see its humbling effect. We see its ultimate suitability to meet all the needs of our soul. We say, this is wisdom. This makes plain the whole meaning of life itself. So should we preach the cross? Paul says it should be the very center of all that the church declares, because by it, souls will be saved. We cannot throw out preaching. We cannot throw out the message of the cross. It's these very things that the lost world will reject until the Lord calls them. And then they will prove its power and its wisdom. May the Lord bless these things to us this evening. Our final hymn is 398. Oh, teach me what it meaneth